So, who am I and why am I here? Let's begin with the worst cold open in the history of speeches, uttered by James Stockdale in 1992 as the vice presidential running mate of Ross Perot during a debate against Dan Quayle and Al Gore, respectively the running mates of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. A Navy Vice Admiral and Medal of Honor winner, Stockdale famously endured 7 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. Prior to his political career, he lectured and wrote about philosophy at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and credited his early encounters with Epictetus and Stoicism as the key to his survival under conditions in Hanoi, conditions that proved fatal for several of his companions who broke down over time. Now, he's credited with the Stockdale paradox. Quote, "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be." Now, this paradox ought to seem familiar to Marxists, recalling Antonio Gramsci's mantra in the prison notebooks, pessimism of the spirit, optimism of the will, which Wang Shifu paraphrased towards the end of his talk yesterday. Now, it's discomforting to juxtapose the words of an imperialist aviator responsible for attacking a communist revolution in Vietnam with those of a communist martyred in a fascist prison. But one wonders whether Gramsci ever asked himself, who am I and why am I here? On the one hand, I can't help but recall the description of Gramsci's body, stunted from birth, less than 5 feet tall, suffering from curvature of the spine, burdened terribly physically and psychologically by prison, and likewise the body of Kierkegaard, also suffering from a spinal problem and similarly frail, and yet the difference between them seems clear, particularly when we consider an insight from C.L.R. James, who wrote, quote, "Beginning with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and reaching a completion in Sartre, modern philosophy expresses its modernity by assuming the form of a personal response to extreme situations and is no less philosophical for that. In contrast," James says, "I record here a sequence of political responses to an extreme political situation." And here he's referencing, of course, the African situation that he was writing about from a Marxist point of view. Now, these comments from me are a prelude to remarks on Foucault's failed politics, revealed once and for all in his lectures, The Hermeneutics of the Subject. There, Foucault seeks a pre-modern hero and settles on Marcus Aurelius, also a Stoic, but not a slave like Epictetus in Greece, but the emperor of Rome. Now, we should read this lecture by Foucault, I think, as the denouement of Foucault's Nietzschean recourse, desperate to find an example of someone capable of, quote, caring for the self, end quote, before the advent of a modern cogito consciousness established the category of human that Nietzsche so abhorred and that Foucault dreamed of being erased by the tide. Now, it's here we should recall Zizek's retort that the cogito is already observable in Augustine long before its Cartesian expression, and thus perhaps Foucault's search was always in vain. On the one hand, we should discount Zizek's critique given his own ideological commitment to an ever-present past, or a past that was already always present, recalling his own commitment to Freud's ahistorical interpretation of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, which we can always see clearly in Zizek's attacks on Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, as well as his defense of Lacan and others. On the other hand, as I've argued elsewhere, the seed of self and self-destruction was already present in Aristotle and the Hindu Vedas, and likely already present in what these shared in common, that they were both thinking and writing in similar ways, in so much as Greek and Sanskrit belong to the same family of languages. So let us allow that there is at least a proto-cogito already present in Augustine and Aristotle, and likewise anyone inclined towards Stoicism, whether slaves or emperors, whether prisoners or prison keepers, aiming to care for the self while understanding that the self was already an abstraction that seeks an escape from the real that's always threatening death or worse. But was it not the return of a radicalized Aristotle, produced substantially by Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, to Europe via Aquinas to counter precisely the threat of Islamic expansion that in turn sparked the Renaissance and then Enlightenment, the scientific and industrial revolutions, the emergence of cogito and the emergence of cogito consciousness. Is this, in fact, not what Hegel and Marx are trying to correct in part with the development of idealist and materialist dialectics? Now, last month, I was in Northeast Greece, traveling from I'm having a hard time speaking today, Alexandroupolis to a local university in Komotini, driven by my host, a vice dean of politics, to give a lecture on China's geostrategic worldview. Over the course of several conversations, interspersed with pointing out landmarks and features we passed as we drove, the vice dean expressed his own worldview. There, he pointed out, is a seaport for which China had placed the winning bid, only to be blocked when the US government pressured Athens to cancel the sale. Today, it's one of the primary ports for shipping heavy weapons to Ukraine. Or over there, he gestures, is an American helicopter base built recently, bringing more money to the region. And you see that pipeline coming up out of the ground? That was built recently to induce Bulgaria to stop buying natural gas from Russia. And you see all these scorched hillsides as we drive? That's due to the wildfires that devastated this region last year. I recounted his comments in a social media post, as well as his remarks that a couple of professors at his school had objected to my lecture, and thus, I know, I'm not to the PPD yet. I recounted his comments in a social media post, as well as his remarks that a couple of professors at his school had objected to my lecture, and thus I was being hosted instead by an institute, not the department. He indicated these professors had previously received funding from the US State Department. I didn't press him for details because he seemed to have regretted his candor, but such details seem unimportant in so much as these kinds of affiliations in politics are common encounters for people like myself and probably people like you as well. Now, the day I posted about my observations in social media, I sent a copy to the person who had arranged my visit, a leading Greek intellectual, who gave me a thumbs up emoji. That doesn't necessarily mean he read it. Maybe he was just being polite. However, a few days ago, I received a letter of protest from the university in Komotini, asserting there are no professors there affiliated with the US State Department, etc. And I replied to that email, which was copied on all the professors, that had copied all the professors in that department, that I had merely reported what I was told and saw, and that I was disinclined to withdraw the post. It was then suggested by someone that I was in fact a liar, or that I was either a fool who listens to fools, or worse, simply a white propagandist serving the CPC, to which one must reply, "You know me, sir," recalling Nietzsche's dirty little paraphrase of Cicero, who in turn was paraphrasing Phaedo, who in turn was paraphrasing Socrates. Last year, I was conducting fieldwork in Ukraine, not far from Kharkiv, interviewing children orphaned by the war, as well as others, including Azov officers who aimed to replace those parents with a new fatherland. Now, the obvious question, were these Azov officers fascist or merely Ukrainian nationalists? Were the right-wingers in Komotini affiliated directly with the US government or less so? Who are they? And what are they doing there? That seems rather obvious and self-described, but even if we can't trust the vice dean, a right-winger himself, a climate change denier, and someone who seemed nostalgic for a military junta, then at least we can read the facts on the terrain he pointed out and that numerous available sources confirm. This gets to why I was in northern Greece this year and Ukraine last year. These are the front lines of a new Cold War or worse. I was there to see that terrain firsthand and to hear from the people who live there. And what I heard corresponded completely with what I saw. So yes, you know me, sir, but let's be clear. I know you too, and quibbling over the petty politics of insignificant details changes nothing about the bigger picture. So speaking of the bigger picture, let me now turn to some of the key points in the lecture that I made in Komatini amid those ruined hillsides, hosting the hegemon's helicopters. After a summer when fires had turned the skies over Athens red and black, like the student colors organizing at the Polytechnic on the anniversary of the uprising against the military government there in Greece. But here, let us focus on China. And the key, in my view, of understanding China's strategic worldview is understanding China's relationship with climate change. Now, hello? Now, this for me is the most important map in the world, not and above all because it has no national boundaries, and as an internationalist that excites me. But it's the most important map because the clearest feature that we can see is this, right? Desertification, moving from Africa all the way across the Middle East, Central Asia, and the dust storms now blowing into Beijing. And here again, we can see a different version of the same thing. And here again. Now we know that we can talk about real abstraction, or we can talk about real facts when it comes to climate change. We know that there have been these significant changes in temperature over time, and that they accelerate with the great acceleration in the middle 20th century. And it's I don't know why this isn't showing up properly, but nevertheless, we have this realization in China that climate change has been responsible for major political and social changes in the past, including contributing to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty. And again, here we can see the association of climate change, the direct association of climate change with the rise of the industrial and scientific revolutions, along with capitalism and competitive nationalism. Now, here we can see water withdrawal as a percentage of total available water, and we can see how the water situation is worsening over the course of 1995 to what's projected for 2025. And then here we can see groundwater depletion by region. Now, the key point to make here is that there's a considerable amount of data to suggest that in terms of numbers of people and the amount of fixed capital investment, China is the most vulnerable country in the world to climate change. And this vulnerability is coming from two sides. One is desertification, which is creating a water crisis. And here in Shandong and Shanghai, Jiangsu, and then down here in Guangdong, we have 3 of the top 5 most vulnerable places due to the rising water and the extreme weather changes that are related in part to their proximity to the ocean, as well as their hyperdevelopment. Now here we can see cities that have water and those that have lost it. And now we're going to just make a quick little detour. So if you pay attention in China and you do a lot of field work or you move around the country, one of the things that you'll see is that there are massive efforts underway to try to salvage the environment. One of the biggest things that I've observed since I've been here since 2010 is a radical change in environmental quality, air quality, and water quality. And this is not something that's in Shanghai alone. We see it in Beijing. We see in many other places in the country. And this is due to a number of major policy shifts that were underway for let's say 20 years, but really began to accelerate with President Xi coming to office and recognizing the pressing scientific need or existential need to address these concerns, but also the incredible popular support for them. So this included things like making local officials responsible for the water and air quality with lifetime accountability. And so what we've seen, for example, is when I first moved to Shanghai, this Suzhou Creek was still almost an open sewer, and now it has been returned to a river where we have water birds, and it's surrounded by green areas. It's a park space going through the city, and people are fishing in it. And that's in the space of 10 years, right? Then we can look at the research that's going on in this is in Hunan, and the understanding that China is still losing arable land, and that in these areas where we have terraces, that something like 20% of China's food is produced in these areas, and that these areas are the least vulnerable to climate change. Now, we don't know how old the terraces are, at least 2,000 years old. So now there are scientific teams going down to study how these terraces are so resistant to climate change, why are they so efficient with the usage of water, and what do we need to do to ensure that they remain green, that they remain organic, but at the same time, what sort of technologies can we bring in that will help alleviate the tremendous burden that's placed on the farmers there to maintain them, given the growing role that they play in supporting Chinese food security. Now, I think most people are aware that China's become the world leading green innovation, green economy developer. There are still certainly brown economy aspects at work, but this picture is supposed to symbolize two things. One is the advance of the green economy, but the next big thing on the horizon is the blue economy. And this is where we're going to see the integration of the green and the blue and a radical transformation of hopefully economic and environmental well-being in the next decade. This is on Chongming Island. Our university has a research facility there. These are where we're trying to restore and protect the wetlands, but this island, Chongming Island, is now completely under the jurisdiction, except for a small little corner that's under Jiangsu. And the purpose of this is to increase the green score and green value, but it's also a barrier island that's helping to protect this region from climate change and oceanic issues. And again, this is, I don't know why this is not translating, but this is in Hefei in Anhui. I was there for a case study a year ago. This is the mayor of Hefei. He has a PhD in environmental science. And what they're doing, there's a massive lake in Hefei, Chaohu. The lake is bigger than the entire municipality, but they've put the entire lake under the jurisdiction of the city, and they're cleaning it up. It was massively polluted. And one of the things they're doing is they're dredging all the heavy metals and other pollutants out of the lake, pressing them into blocks, like concrete blocks, and then they're trucking them up into the mountains where there are these depleted coal mines, and then storing those blocks down in the coal mines. And the goal is to restore the ecological health of the lake. In the meantime, the other thing that they're doing is they are building or reestablishing a ring of wetlands around the city, 8 wetlands. And what these are accomplishing are carbon traps. And what they're building in Hefei is a green, a protected green zone against the future problems that are coming. And at the same time, they've got massive investment in green tech industries within that part of the country. So this is yet another sort of major sort of ecological project that we see taking place. Now this here, this is it's difficult to really convey, but this is a major effort to create a massive canal and aqueduct system with these massive pumps to move water back into the Northwest to try to ensure that those cities retain the water they need to survive. And to be honest with you, I don't think we could imagine this sort of work being done or accomplished anywhere else in the world. Now, the context here is that you have, in terms of the geopolitical context, is that we have the U.S., which has tried to create something like the Quad, and then, you know, there are various military installations that they have surrounding China. And then we have China's efforts with the 9-dash line or 10-dash line now to create an effective line of defense against these encroachments. Keeping in mind that one of the things that I forgot to point out there is Hainan, and Hainan is where they now have a new commercial spaceport. You know, there's an advantage of having the spaceport closer to the equator. Anyway, now I was in London 3 weeks ago to give a talk at Historical Materialism, and this was the talk that I was giving. It was about my research in Ukraine, and I want to summarize that research in the context of this discussion. So the main thesis is that the conflict in Ukraine is substantially a proxy war between the US and Russia. On the one hand, we can understand it as a long-running conflict between Russia and the US after the collapse of the USSR. Over that period of time, the US repeatedly advanced NATO in Europe, penetrated Central Asia, and undermined key Russian defensive positions at Crimea and Syria. We can say this is perhaps a new Cold War and the return of great power competition, or we can remark that the old Cold War never really ended. On the other hand, we can also understand this as two fossil fuel dependent countries fighting over control of energy markets and how we pay for energy. In one sense, this is an absolute struggle. However, we can also see via the cunning of reason, if nothing else, that these two countries are playing a strategic endgame with climate change. In this respect, they might also be viewed as complicit adversaries. There, I'm stealing that term from Bourdieu, his book Homo Academicus, that are maximizing their own interest in this conflict at the expense of others. And it's important to recall that in 2023, the U.S. consolidated its position as the world's leading producer of oil and gas. American energy companies made record profits. Biden expanded oil production in the environmentally protected areas of Alaska. Americans still paid high cost push inflation, which the U.S. blamed on Russia, which had its impetus in expanding the U.S. money supply by 20% in 2020 and 2021 to pay for the U.S. economic collapse due to the pandemic. The other point here simply to make is that the U.S. economy is a house of cards that is based entirely on sustaining the dollar as the global currency, and the dollar, of course, has a close relationship with oil via the petrodollar. Okay, so, and then, you know, just to link the discussion, these are the Israeli troops that just crossed into Syria, and this is what's happening in Gaza. But we need to understand that the conflict in the Middle East and the conflict in Ukraine are linked directly to climate change, but also pipeline wars and energy, right? So why is it that certain countries, certain Islamic countries didn't want to firmly break with Israel, including even Turkey? It's because they were selling energy to Israel. So let me go back to some of the other comments. Who am I and why am I here? On the one hand, despite Earning a doctorate in critical theory more than 20 years ago, my work has become more deeply engaged with political praxis in recent years, and I'm struggling to connect intellectually with discussions and concepts that fixate so much on theory, which may or may not be a fair description of this conference. On the other hand, perhaps I have a few comments to add to our discussion about real abstraction. Now, I'm rather disinclined to associate the arrival of real abstraction with the development of coinage. For a Marxist, such an argument smacks too much of convenience. Sure, let's blame it on money, but to paraphrase Mao Zedong, where do correct ideas come from? Do they drop from the skies? Are they innate in the mind? No, they come from social practice and from it alone. In short, I suspect real abstraction is much older than the appearance of coins and perhaps even more broadly applicable to the human condition than imagined even by Toscano. Here, I concur in part with Harry's talk yesterday, including the theories derived from cognitive archaeology. There was an evolutionary development that occurred, and the neurocognitive capacity for abstraction is key, but not just for tool making by hand, but also by using vocal cords. As linguistic structuralism demonstrated, and as even Aquinas understood in part, the acquisition of language and the capacity for ratiocination comes from this ability for abstraction. However, as I asked yesterday, if we're unable to place any civilizational or historical qualifications on these developments, then we potentially risk promoting a biologically determinist position for capitalism. Now, I heard Harry's counter that capitalism, in fact, exploits the capacity for real abstraction and then fetters it. And then I heard Paul's concerns in another discussion, which I understood as being a related discussion, that AI might emerge or has perhaps already emerged as a device that further normalizes a reduction in the capacity or quality of critical thinking. And I have a similar fear for a number of reasons, including the simple fact that coding or simulative computer thought is always based on linear thought, ones and zeros. Now, from my own interactions with ChatGPT and other large language models, I haven't observed yet their capacity yet to simulate dialectical thinking. I mean, we must wonder whether a large language model is invariably in a tautological relationship with the grammar of the languages that created it, and not just a cultural hegemony within. To be sure, we can point to different historical periods. We can characterize them in terms of the modes and relations of production at their core. We can point to capitalism beginning sometime in the 17th or 18th century. We can point to proto-capitalism beginning before then, certainly present in England under Henry VIII and arguably much sooner. Elsewhere, much like we can observe the cogito appearing explicitly with Descartes, but a proto-cogito already present in Augustine, Marcus Aurelius, Alexander, Aristotle, and the writers of the Vedas, and so on. Now, what do all these people have in common? Again, it's the prefigured, it's a logic prefigured linguistically, where the shared ontological principle is the law of non-contradiction. Forget the unmoved mover in the metaphorical gravity well of Aristotle's metaphysics. Aristotle simply makes the same mistake that everyone else makes in the West until Hegel and his children point out the obvious, the privileged presence of the self opposed to the category of the other neglected through immanent critique. Sure, we have Augustine's Confessions, or more powerfully, we have Siddhartha's Meditations under a banyan tree. But as Confucian critics long ago pointed out, denying the self to save the self, and literally the aim to save oneself for heaven and not for hell, or nirvana and not rebirth, to escape the material horrors of real life, is merely a repetition of an original sin. Now, such is Paradise Lost. To recall Milton's Beautiful Failure, a poem that encouraged precisely the opposite of his intentions. Milton meant to describe the secular and materialist changes of his era as no less dangerous than Satan tempting Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and yet so many of Milton's Enlightenment contemporaries instead read Paradise Lost as an encounter with Lucifer, the light bringer, who, like Prometheus, brought knowledge to humans, freeing them from the prison of ignorance imposed via required submissions to God or gods that do not exist. In short, I think real abstraction is not a source of the problem or the source of the solution. I think this is clear in terms of our understanding now of real abstraction as a theoretical and practical concept in Western civilization, and the roles it plays in human development, and the fact that real abstraction has also been part of Chinese civilization, which nevertheless managed to do something very different with it. Now, I'm going to skip to the end here, and and come back to a point that I was trying to get to uh, this morning in one of the comments. Um, this idea of civilization, and is there something different in Chinese civilization? Um, Now, I'm going to skip over the part where I talk about that China is a latecomer to nationalism, and that a lot of scholars have talked about China as a civilizational idea and not a national idea, but that one that was forced to reconfigure itself, and it took about a century from the 1840s with the Opium Wars until the end of the Civil War, and liberation was achieved in 1949 before it could reconstitute itself as a sovereign nation. But one of the things that I think we have to look at is the extent to which President Xi in recent years has been emphasizing civilization. And I don't think this is merely a counter concept in those you have yours and we have ours, and that is what justifies what we do. This is sort of the way it's been interpreted in the West. What I see is that he's also talking about older values, that we need to recover values. And in this context, we can point to one specifically, the idea from Lao Tzu that has now been embedded in Chinese Marxism, which is you have to promote harmony between man and nature. And then we can extend this, I think, with the new internationalism that we're seeing coming out of Beijing, which includes concepts like building an ecological civilization and trying to promote those values through other initiatives like the Belt Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and so on, in order to facilitate a shared future. Now, whether or not all of these things are completely, perfectly realizable, or that whether or not everyone in Beijing is on the same page, these are the points that I would hope to promote and encourage as a political agent, less so than a theoretical one. Thank you.